It's not an epiphenomenon. It has nothing whatsoever to do with neurons. And in fact, it is rooted in the very, very first principle of all, which is God. Because the contemporary thinking is characterized by the fact that almost instinctively, contemporary Western man wants to understand everything from the bottom, which he conceives more or less in terms of a quantum mechanics. And this is, to me, the epitome of error. And in fact, I would justify this claim by pointing out that the contemporary metaphysics is really nothing new, but it is a revival of the philosophy of Democritus, who famously said, the vulgar believe in qualities, color, the sweet and the bitter, but in reality there is only atoms and the void. So this is basically not only the oldest, one of the oldest philosophical positions of mankind, but it has been revived in the 17th century, and it has become our modern credo. And let me mention that very soon after Democritus propounded his theory concerning atoms and the void, Plato attacked it, and I believe rigorously disqualified this position once and for all. And so for 2,000 years thereafter, the well-informed regarded this atomistic metaphysics as a heresy. And so what happened in the 17th century, under the aegis of people like Descartes and Galileo, that ancient heresy was revived and became the foundation of what we nowadays call the Enlightenment. Platonism doesn't stand alone. It is inherently the same as the Vedic tradition. There are certain differences, but in essence it is the same doctrine. That the Platonist metaphysics is in a sense the diametric opposite of what contemporary intellectuals believe, because contemporary intellectuals believe that it all begins with atoms. Nowadays, this is conceived evidently in quantum mechanical terms, but metaphysically speaking, it's just atoms and the void, very much as Democritus conceived of it at the beginning of the 5th century BC. So in a sense, you can say there's nothing new under the sun, because stripped of its technical aspects, the contemporary worldview is basically Democritus all over again. And it is as much a heresy today as it was in the early days of Democritus. In other words, it is simply false to say that everything arises from particles. There's no evidence in that to that effect People may think so, but if you dig into it a little bit more deeply, you find that all these purported scenarios really prove to be baseless. And if you go into it with any kind of mathematical depth, you find quickly enough that this contemporary scenario, which tries to reduce everything to aggregates of particles, actually proves to be impossible. And in fact, it may interest many people to know that starting in the year 1998, this philosophy, this Weltanschauung, has really been disproved. It turns out to be mathematically impossible. And it's very simple. I think I can explain that in a few words comprehensible to the non-specialist. If you start out with particles, then you need to talk about evolution. You need to introduce this term because somehow these particles have to give rise to all that there is, beginning with the planetary system and the simplest organic structures. So everything has to arise by way of quote-unquote evolution. This is a given, because obviously we live not in a world of particles, but in a world of something which may conceivably reduce to an aggregate of particles, but it certainly is not what appears to us. So what I'm trying to say is that if you base yourself on an ontology of particles, then evolution is an absolute necessity to go from these particles to the world which we inhabit.
And because the world which we inhabit is more than the sum of its parts. That's also one of the things you seem to keep pressing on in this book of yours, that there is an irreducible whole that you cannot take apart, you cannot atomize it. And this is also one of the things you stress.
Yes, I do stress this, but the point, Jack, is that according to the contemporary scientific mindset, everything does reduce to a sum of parts. This is what our Weltanschauung insists upon. Physics, by its very modus operandi, assumes as much. The only reason physics can understand an object, whatever it may be, is if that object is a sum of parts, because that's how physics operates. That's where differential equations come into the picture. So our contemporary science is predicated upon this assumption that the world consists of sums of parts. And now I wanted to point out that it turns out, and incidentally, that's another way of introducing the idea of evolution. It's the same thing. If you start with particles, then the world and everything in it is a result of evolution. These parts come together to form wholes, and so you get ever more complicated aggregates of particles, and this is the explanation of the world in which we find ourselves. Over a rigorous mathematical theorem proved in the year 1998 by an American mathematician named William Dembski. And what Dembski proved is really very, very simple, although the proof is not very simple, but the idea is very simple. Dembski proved that if you have something sufficiently complicated, then it becomes mathematically impossible to suppose that this entity came about by chance. If you have some stochastic random process, like tossing a coin, the likelihood that this will somehow spell out all the volumes in the Library of Congress in their chronological order is so small that it is rigorously impossible. And this is what Dembski proved in this so-called intelligent design theorem, which was published in a book, Cambridge University Press in 1998. So what the theorem of Dembski affirms is that a causality operating in time, which is the causality of physics, cannot produce what is called complex specified information. The information upon which physics is based cannot produce complex specified information. And since even the simplest forms of life, an amoeba, as it were, embodies huge quantities of complex specified information, it follows from Dembski's theorem that a natural process, a process that physics can understand, could not have formed that organic organism, that amoeba. So the point that I'm making is that actually with Dembski's theorem, evolution as we normally conceive of it has become mathematically impossible. As a general statement of what I discovered rather early in life is that our so-called scientific Weltanschauung, which entails the idea, for example, of evolution and life springing from fundamental particles ultimately, that this is not a scientific fact. There's no proof of this. On the contrary, as I've just said, there are mathematical theorems that disprove that possibility. But the point is that our Weltanschauung, which claims to be scientific and, if you will, objective, is in fact ideology driven.